And we move on to the next hand. This time we have ace queen suited. In under the gun, we raise it up and tight semi-rack 3 bets. Yeah, I think no decision here. Folding is usually a bit too weak, so I think calling is in order. To 4-bet bluff, I think the hand is just a little bit too strong and we are fairly deep, so I think this justifies the call. Flop is not too bad. Flop is queen 9-10, so nothing to say about the flop. Our opponent bets 100 into 177. Again, no decision. We just toss in the call. Turn is a 9. Definitely interesting card, because we should have way more 9x hands than he. So we check. He bets 260. And now it's decision time. Should we check raise? Should we check call? Or should we check fold? What's your idea here? I think it's important to see that Villain's range here is just super strong, because he 3-bets against an under the gun open, and when he's a tight semi-rack, he's just not a good player in general. So most of the time he will just have a hand like kings, queens, aces in this situation, and the problem is he's never folding a better hand than ace queen, because most players are not good enough to fold a hand like pocket kings or pocket aces on a board texture like this. I think better players are definitely capable, and other players will definitely check back the turn, but most semi-racks that are tight are usually pretty bad post-flop. They are just playing fairly tight and very aggressive with their overpairs, and they are never folding, and that's why I think bluffing with ace-queen makes no sense. But I also think his range is just way too tight to justify calling here, and that's why I think we should just give up against his range. And against a lot of other players, we have a fairly easy call on the turn, because they can have some straight draws, so Jack X type hands. They can have hands like ace king in their bluffing range, but a tight semi-rack is never ever going to bluff those hands on the turn, and that's why we should fold those hands. I know this turn fold is very hard when you're in the game, but really try to think about bluff combinations that make sense in your eyes, and definitely try to think about Villain's preflop 3-bet range. And against this opponent, there's really nothing we can do, and that's why folding is the only option in this situation. And we move on to this ace-jack suited hand. As we can see, one player limps an MP. We ISO to 15 bucks. Goodrex calls, small blind and big blind come along, and the limper folds, so 4-way to the flop. Flop is not too bad. Flop is ace 9 deuce rainbow. The blinds check, and with ace jack it's close, but I think value betting is okay, so we go ahead and value bet 35 bucks. Only the tight passive player calls, and we bink the turn, so the turn is a jack and spades, so we make top 2 pair. In this situation, our opponent checks, and the question is, how much should we bet? So as we can see, the pot is 133. Our opponent has only 130. Looks like we should always jam the turn, right? But here we have the problem that maybe our opponent is folding a weaker ace to our all-in on the turn. So as an exploit, it definitely makes sense to size smaller, because most very tight passive opponents have no clue about bet sizing, and therefore we can definitely try to exploit those players by betting small with stronger hands on the turn, because then they are never able to get away from the hand on the river, because the pot is just way too huge for that. And that's why I think betting 50 on the turn is way better as an exploit than just going all in, because those players can definitely hero fold on the turn. Sometimes you're really surprised when you see what they can fold on the turn, and every time we bet a bit smaller, they just increase their calling range, and that's why I think betting 50 on the turn is really the perfect sizing. But really make sure that the board is very dry when there are a ton of draws out there, definitely just go for the shove, because otherwise they will be priced in with their straight and flush draws, and we don't want that. And yeah, on this very dry board texture, betting small makes sense, because hands like queen 10 or spade are usually not in villain's range, and therefore betting small is the best bet size. And we move on to a stronger hand. This time we have ace king. MP Goodrek opens, again no decision, we always 3-bet. And the Goodrek calls, so heads up to the flop. Flop is not too bad, definitely a board that we can always fire, so we go ahead and fire 50 into 174. Our opponent calls, turn is a queen. And so now is the question, should we continue against the Goodrek or not? Should we check behind? We have some showdown value of ace king high, or should we turn our hand into a bluff? To answer the question, I think it's super important to think about villain's calling range. And I think villain's calling range on the flop are some flush draws, hands like all the pocket pairs between, I don't know, 5 and jacks, something like this. Of course, hands like jack X, but not all the jack X, cause hands like jack 10 off, queen jack offsuit, king jack offsuit, I think he's not defending against the 3-bet preflop. Even ace jack offsuit, I think he's going to fold those hands most of the time or always. And yeah, I think that's really it. So not too much queen X should be in his range. I think ace queen, especially ace queen in hearts, definitely possible that he floats this hand on the flop, and queen jack suited is also an option. But besides from that, I don't think he can very often have a queen, and the queen is for sure very often in our range with a hand like king queen suited or ace queen. So yeah, I think betting the turn as a bluff is a pretty good idea. We have decent equity when we get called. Very often when we bink the ace or bink the king, we have the best hand. When we bink the dream card, the 10 on the row, we always have the best hand, and that's why I think it's important to continue on the turn. So really ask yourself if your opponent can fold enough hand combinations on the turn from his flop calling range, and if you have enough equity when you get called, or if this is not possible. All those points are true in this hand, and that's why we decide to barrel this turn card. And it works, our opponent folds. And we continue with king queen suited from the hijack. Of course, awesome hand. We raise it up, only the ABC semi-rec in the big blind calls. And flop is not too bad, king 7-4, 2 hearts, so very easy c-bet. He calls. Turn is not the best card in the world, but also not the worst card. We still get a ton of value from worse kings, from straight draws like 5-6, and all the flush draws. That's why betting the turn is a very good idea, and we shouldn't size too small, because we definitely want to be a bit more polarized on the turn with our betting range. Therefore 35 bucks are in order. And now the ABC semi-rec check raises. He makes it 90 to go. And in this situation, I think against a very good opponent, the situation is not that complicated, because we beat all his bluffs, so we just toss in the call. But the problem here is really that we play against a semi-rec, and most of those players have absolutely no bluffing range ever on this turn card. So they just rep a 7, and they always have a 7. So the situation is quite easy, and that's where we should always go ahead and fold when we know that our opponent is not good enough to turn straight draws or flush draw or whatever into a bluff. And there are a ton of players like this out there. They don't see why they should check raise as a bluff on the turn, because they get paid often enough when they just raise a 7. That's their idea. Of course, this is just wrong, because when we know this, we can make those huge laydowns on the turn. And yeah, make sure that your opponent is good enough to have a bluffing range on those turn cards, because otherwise they will show you a very strong hand way too often, and that's why folding against a lot of players is a good idea, especially on the lower stakes. There are a lot of very bad regulars that just raise for value on those turn and river cards. Okay, next hand, pocket jacks. Again, easy open. There's a whale in the big blind, so we definitely should raise a bit bigger. And the loose passive opponent in the big blind also defends his big blind. Not too bad. Flops also okay-ish, just one overcard. On this board texture against those two opponents, I think both options are fine. So Hero decided to check back, and again, turn is an interesting part of this hand, because whale leads 30 and loose passive opponent calls. The question is our hand strong enough to call the turn or not? This is really the question in this hand. What would you do in a situation like this with those players? And on the turn, the price is the most important thing. As you can see, we have to call 30 for 135. So we don't have to be good that often. And that's where we usually should toss in the call here. And the reason is also that we play against those two players. Because the first player is a whale. He can bet a really large variety of hands on the turn. He can bet with some pairs, flush draws, straight draws, random hands. I've seen it all. So against his range, we are a huge favorite. And the loose passive opponent has definitely some King X type hands, but he's also calling with so many pairs like 8x, 6x, 4x, pair plus draw hands, so 4, 5, 6, 7, 7, 8 diamonds. And that's why our hand is definitely way too good to toss this hand into the muck when the small blind is a tight semi-rack and the big blind is a tight passive player. Then I think it's way too thin to call, even with this price. We should fold our hand because it will be very hard to realize our equity, and we can most of the time not call another river bet. But against those two opponents, please always toss in the call. So again, to get to the correct answer, definitely think about all the ranges in the hand and not just look at the price and think, oh wow, I don't have to be good that often, I call. Definitely try to think about the whale's leading range and the other players' calling range in the big blind. And when you know you have a very good equity against both ranges, you're ahead of both ranges often enough, then calling makes sense, and then you should toss in the call. Okay, next hand is pocket kings. Two players limp. Of course we ISO, and we want to ISO really big, as you can see, because the second limper is a whale / maniac, so he does not care about our raise sizing. So with our very strong value hands, we definitely want to increase our raise size, so we make it 25. And only the maniac calls. Flop is very favorable. Flop is Jack 6-3 rainbow, so we pretty much flop the world. Pretty dry board against the maniac. Yeah, we just make a standard c-bet, and as we can see with his effective stack size for 25 bucks, we get all in by the river. He calls, turn is a 3, another good card, and now he leads. As you can see, he has 120 behind, and the only question here is, should we raise or should we call, and why is this the better play? And on the turn, I think we have a pretty clear call, and most people would raise the turn. And the problem by raising is that we can't have any bluffs, because we are never going all in as a bluff or with middling type hand. So when we have pocket nines here, sure, I think calling is fine, but raising is not the best option. And once again, it's important to look at villain's range. So our opponent is a whale / maniac, so he can again have a large variety of hands. He can have hands like Jack X, 6x, 3x, but he can also have random hands like ace 10, ace 9, whatever. Sometimes you really see funny hands, and I think he has not too often a hand like 4-5, and even if he has this hand, he has so many bluffs or semi-strong hands that this should not matter to us. The most important thing here is really that our opponent is bad enough to have a lot of bluffs on the turn, and he's usually going to continue with those bluffs on the river because he just thinks he has enough fold equity, and our game plan is just to close our eyes and call any river. So if the river is a jack or an ace or whatever, we don't care. We just have to call every river because our opponent does not always have an ace or a jack in his hand. He has a ton of weaker hands, and the problem is when our opponent really has a super weak hand and we jam the turn. So for example, our opponent has really ace 9, ace 10, and we jam. I think he's not bad enough usually to call his all-in with just one overcard, so he will realize that we probably have a strong hand and he will fold. But when we just call, most opponents just stick with their plan and stick all their money in on the river, and that's why calling is so much more profitable than raising. And we move on to another very interesting hand on the turn. This time we have King 9 suited, ABC rec in Under the Gun opens, loose passive calls, maniac calls, tight passive in the small blind calls, and with King 9 suited, yeah, awesome pot odds, awesome hand. So we defend. Flop is okay-ish, so it goes check around. The turn is an 8. So now the action starts on the small blind, and the small blind decides to lead 55. And as we can see, the opponent is a tight passive player. What would you do in a spot like this? Would you call? Would you raise? Would you fold? And again, we have to think about villain's range. So when he's tight passive, I don't think that those player types usually lead hands like Jack 10 or spades. And this is a problem in this hand, that they usually don't lead those hands. Usually the leading range on, or the donking range on the turn is something like King Jack, King Queen, sometimes even hands like Ace King, pocket 5s, pocket 8s, yeah, and really that's about it. Yeah, they don't have enough bluffs on the turn. Some tight passive players bluff never, ever, ever. They only play their value hands or bet their value hands and check call with their draws. And we also have 3 other players behind, and a lot of them can have a better king. So even the ABC rec can have better kings, I think, in some percentage of the time. Same applies to the loose passive opponent in MP on the hijack. But against the tight passive player alone, because we play 5-handed, this is also another problem. I think 5-handed people are way less inclined to bluff with their draws, and especially when they're playing a very tight passive playing style, then I think they have really 0 bluffs usually in their range. And that's why I think the correct play, the correct way to play this hand is to muck our hand on the turn. Because our hand looks pretty strong, because on the flop it went check, check, check. And we see this turn card, we have still top pair and an okay-ish kicker. But when we think about villain's range, we see that we will never have the best hand on the river. And that's why it is important to lay down our hand on the turn. Moving on, this time we have ace jack suited on the hijack, and yeah, bad news, the good rec 3 bets from the button, and with ace jack suited we have a fairly easy call. Flop is pretty good for our hand. We flop top pair, top kicker, and the backdoor flush draw. Our opponent bets, again, very easy check call. Turn is not the best card in the world. Turn is a king. Our opponent can have a lot of King X type hands. So we check again. Our opponent bets, and the question is, should we call or should we fold? What's your game plan on this turn card? And again, just try to think about villain's range. Is it possible that that our opponent is going to bluff a lot of King X type hands on the turn? And when we think about it, yes, I think this makes sense. He should have a lot of suited gapper type hands, so turned flush draws. He can definitely have hands like ace queen that he's going to bluff on the turn, and I think he does not have a ton of value hands in his range. So his value hands are basically pocket jacks, pocket kings, pocket aces. Of course, with king jack, I think most of the time he's going to call preflop. Same applies to pocket 8s, pocket 5s. So he can't have those hands. And yeah, that's why he usually has a very polarized range on the turn, and that's why we can never fold a jack in a situation like this. Otherwise, when we fold this ace-jack type hand on the turn, we are folding way too many hands on the turn. When you think about our flop calling range and about our turn folding range, you have to realize that we can't fold too many hands, especially not against a good regular, because he is a thinking player and therefore he will bluff often enough on this turn. This is a great card for him to bluff, because he should have more King X type hands in his range after his c-bet on the flop, because we should have way more pairs and Jack X type hands. And that's why we can never give up the turn with our strong jack, never ever. So yeah, again, everything comes down to Villain's range pre-flop, on the flop, and on the turn. And yeah, as we see, his range is definitely loose enough. And when you play against another good reg, just think about yourself. So what are we doing in a situation like this? How many bluffs would I bet on this turn card? And yeah, we are betting a lot of bluffs, and therefore calling with ace-jack is definitely in order. Moving on to the next hand, this time ABC semi-reg opens to 10. We have 10 hands suited on the cutoff. We can definitely call with this hand. And yeah, we go four-handed to the flop. We flop absolutely nothing. Everyone checks to us, but our hand is not good enough to bluff. Not good enough to value bet, and that's why we check. Turn is a good card, so we pick up the backdoor flush draw. Yeah, loose passive and ABC reg check again. And now the ABC semi-reg bets 20. Usually in a situation like this against better players, we are most of the time calling, because they still can have a lot of strong hands. But the situation is different with those ABC semi-regs, because when they have a king, they're pretty much always betting the flop. And this is a problem. So Villain's range here is most of the time 8x, 9s, 10s, jacks, queens, something like this. Sometimes very bad bluffs, but usually not. Most of the time you really see a second pair hand in his betting range, and that's why I think it's the perfect timing to put in the the raise on the turn, because we still have decent equity when we get called, and we have so much fold equity. We can definitely have a strong hand here that we are slow playing, so pocket eights, pocket deuces sometimes, at least in his eyes, pocket fours, and yeah, most ABC semi-regs are not thinking too much about ranges. They're just looking at their hand. They see they have pocket jacks on king 8 deuce 4. They bet the turn quite small. They face action, and so they just go ahead and fold. So as you can see, it's really important to break down the ranges, to look against which player type are we playing, how can we exploit those players, and this time we can definitely exploit our opponent by raising, cause otherwise, yes, the price is not too bad. We'll make maybe some money, maybe not, if we bink our card on the river, but raising the turn is for sure profitable, and that's why we do this and go for the turn raise. Okay, moving on to pocket kings. Yeah, loose passive limbs. Of course, we ISO 225. Very loose, aggressive opponent on the cutoff calls. Big blind flats and limper calls. So four-handed to the flop. Flop is queen 8-7, not too bad. Against a very loose aggressive player and a loose passive player. We definitely should c-bet this hand for value. We want to bet a very polarized range on a board texture like this, especially with a very loose aggressive opponent behind. We don't want to put ourselves in too many tough situations. So yeah, we bet he calls, all the other players fold. So heads up to the turn, and the turn is probably the best card ever. Turn is a deuce. Yeah, and the question is, do you want to bet, do you want to check, and why? And I think most of the time here, I definitely prefer betting the turn most of the time, and against a very loose aggressive opponent, I think checking is actually a quite good idea, because when we check and he has any draw, So hands like diamonds, 9-10, jack-9s, jack-9, or queen X, he's just going to bet all those hands on the turn, and he's not betting very small usually. So yeah, we check, our opponent bets 165, and of course our plan is not to check call, our plan is to check raise, and there's only one bet size that makes sense, and the only bet size that makes sense is all in. And the good thing here is when our opponent has a queen, he's never ever ever going to fold, because there are way too much draws out there. He gets a fairly decent price on the call, so against every queen we are winning the hand, or we are getting it in very good on the turn. And when we play against a very loose aggressive player, there's really no way he's ever going to fold a queen X type hand once he bet his hand on the turn. And the good thing is, when we just bet our hand, there's an ugly river card, we have no clue. So when the river, for example, is a 9 of diamonds, should we still value bet the river? Should we check call? Should we check fold? Really, really hard sometimes against those aggressive players. So we maximize our value there, and we also win more against their draws, because when we bet, their draws are never folding. And on the river, again, we have a close decision if we should value bet against queen X or check. And once they bet their draws, same story, price is too good, they can never fold a diamond draw. Sometimes they're just calling with straight draws. So yeah, super profitable situation when you play against a maniac or very loose aggressive players. Definitely check a very strong hand often enough on the turn, because they are really going for it. Sometimes they are just ripping it in with their draws, even when they're only 250 in the pot, or less they're just going all in, and you just have to put your chips into the pot. So again, our play definitely varies against which player we play against. Against other players, I can definitely see myself check calling here or just betting for value, but against a very loose aggressive player, I think check raising has the highest EV, and that's why we check shove here. Okay, next hand we have king 10 suited. So standard raise, lag calls, and good rake calls. Flop is not too bad. We flop an open-ended with backdoor flush draw and 2 overcards. So I think c-betting is alright. Lag calls, good rake folds, that's a good thing. So turn is the deuce, and the question is, how should we play this turn? Should we bet again? Should we check raise? Or should we check call? What's a good idea on a board like this against the lag? So the first question that comes to our mind is, do we have enough fold equity? And I think it's obvious that we don't have enough fold equity on the turn, because once he calls the flop with one player behind, he has some middling type hands, he has some 8x, 9x flush draws, but he's never ever going to fold those hands. And that's why I think betting is not a good idea. We also have not enough equity to continue when we think we don't have enough fold equity. So checking is really important here. He bets fairly small. He bets under half pot, and that's why I think check calling is okay. Sometimes we have the best hand here with king high. He's loose aggressive, so when the turn is a 6 or a jack, he will bluff sometimes. When the river is a king, he will bluff sometimes. When the river is a 10, then we have a tough decision, and we just hope to go to showdown. And yes, sometimes we will just show the best hand and win and take it down. So again, it just depends on villain's range. When our opponent's floats very loose on the flop, sure, we can sometimes bet the turn, we have enough fold equity. But against the lag with one player behind, there's no way he's folding enough hands on the turn, and therefore checking is important. And also when our opponent bets way bigger on the turn, so when our opponent bets, I don't know, 120 or whatever, or 110, I think yeah, we should just go ahead and usually fold against his betting range, because we have not enough implied odds. The pot odds are very bad, and yeah, therefore just toss your hand into the mug. But when we get a very good price, he can still have a lot of worse hands, worse draws, then calling is in order. Next hand we have pocket aces. So we raise and both blinds call. Flop is okay-ish. Flop is 10-8-5, 2 clubs. So again, polarized c-bet range, and of course aces should be strong enough to c-bet here. Pretty easy value bet. And both opponents call. So 3-handed to the turn, and the turn is a 7 of diamonds. So as we can see, brings the backdoor flush draw and completes 1 or 2 straight draws. So the question is, do you want to check behind or do you want to value bet again with aces? And yeah, the turn completed some straight draws, and there are also now some 2-pair combinations, and that's why I think betting the turn is usually way too thin with pocket aces against 2 opponents. Yes, some worse hands are calling, but we have no clue what we should do when we get check raised here, and I don't think that those players are calling with a worse 10 2 times, and that's why I think on this turn card pot controlling is way more important than value betting. So in situations like this, when some straight raw 2-pair combinations get there on the turn and you are multi-way, pot controlling is usually way more important, because otherwise it's really hard to continue on some rivers, and it's also really hard to continue when one opponent goes all in. Then yeah, you always have a tough decision if you can call, if he has enough semi-bluffs in his range or not, and that's why I think checking is better. And with this play we also underrepresent our hand a little bit, and on the river I think the situation will be way easier to handle. Okay, now we have king queen on the cutoff, 3 players limp, and there's also passive whale in there, so definitely make sure to raise big enough. So yeah, we make it 20 and 2 players call, 1 weak semi-rack and the passive whale, so things worked out. Flop is pretty good, we flop top here, good kicker, so we definitely c-bet here for value, and the passive whale calls. So turn is a 7, no need to check back with this hand. The passive whale is still calling with 10x, king x, queen jack, all the other draws and combo draws. Yeah, even with hands like pair plus straight draws, so 8, 9, 6, 7, whatever, I think he's going to continue. So we bet 120. Of course, there are so many draws out there, shouldn't size too small. And yeah, now the passive whale surprises us by going all in on the turn, and we have to think about the situation if we beat enough hands. And yeah, there are a lot of passive whales out there, so they call a ton, really a ton of worse hands, but when they go all in they really have it, so they're never going all in with a weaker hand than 2 pairs, so they just have sets, straights and 2-pair type hands. And yeah, this is a problem in situations like this. So very often you're really up against hands like Jack 9, and we don't have a lot of equity against those hands. We're pretty much drawing that against his range. I mean, yes, we have some outs if he has 2-pair, but not a ton, and therefore for around 300 bucks more, we should definitely make a tough laydown. So as you can see, there are definitely differences between whales. There are some whales just that call down very active and also go all in on a lot of turn cards with weak holdings. But when we talk about passive whales, this is just not going to happen. They are just calling with every hand, try to make their hand by the river, and love to hero call on the river. But when they make action themselves, they really have a super strong hand, and that's where you have to pay attention to those players and definitely overfold the turn when they go all in. Okay, we're moving on. We have HX suited in the small blind, 2 players limp, so easy ISO with HX suited. Very loose passive opponent calls, and the limpers fold. Flop is quite good. Top pair, good kicker. Heads up against the very loose passive players, so only one option. We value bet. Our opponent calls. Turn is definitely not the perfect card in the deck. Turn is a 7 of diamonds. Yeah, what should we do here? Should we bet again? Should we check call? Should we check fold? What's your idea against a very loose passive opponent? And I think in general checking is a good idea on this turn card. Just pot control a little bit against a lot of players. We don't have 3 streets, but when our opponent is very loose and he's passive, he's just going to call way too many hands to our turn bet and not bluff enough hands on the turn. Therefore we can value bet more hands. So we bet 65 and we know our opponent is calling so many worse hands and make a ton of money with this hand. And yeah, now something interesting happens. Our passive opponent raises. So basically this is the same story than the hand with the passive whale. So yeah, very loose passive players also calling a lot of hands, but when he raises, usually has not a weaker hand than ace jack offsuit in his range. We can't improve our hand very often because yeah, his raising range is very often a flush, and that's why again folding is in order. Looks kind of nitty, but yeah, we bet the turn as an exploit, and when he raises, he usually has a very strong hand, and that's why we just give up and fold. And again, we definitely need to know this player to bet the turn and also to make this laydown on the turn. Otherwise, you maybe fold too many hands, but when you're sure that his raising range is very strong, he usually never bluffs the turn, he's usually a very passive opponent, then I can't see that he has a lot of bluff combinations on a runout like this, because we could also have a lot of super strong flushes in our range. So yeah, here folding is the correct play. Okay, we are moving on. 10-9 suited from the cutoff, so easy steal. Aggressive rack makes it 35. Again, our hand is good enough to call, so we don't need to 4-bet, and folding is also a question. Yeah, flop is jack 7-4, rainbow. Our opponent bets 35. With our gut shot and backdoor flush draw, I think, yeah, calling is again pretty much the only option with our hand, and the turn is quite favorable. We turn the flush draw, and of course we should check again to our aggressive opponent. He bets 90 into 144. And yeah, now it's decision time. Should we call again? Should we fold? Should we raise? And again, think about villain's range and your range. When he is aggressive regular, he has a ton of bluffs on the turn. When he's aggressive, he usually has way more bluffs than very strong hands in his range. And therefore, we have only one option, and this option is to go all in on the turn. He cannot call with a lot of hands, only with very strong hands like top pair, good kicker, and better type hands usually. I think he's folding all the other hands, and he's of course folding all his bluffs. And that's the reason why check shoving makes sense. Also, check raising smaller makes no sense, because when you raise to, I don't know, 220 with 100 something behind, what do you want to do on the river? Check fold, bluff again. This makes no sense, because we really need fold equity. When you have a value hand, we want to protect from all the draws and everything, so we go all in when we have pocket sevens. So we should also go all in when we have 10-9 suited on the turn. And the good thing here is always when we get called, so for example our opponent really has ace king, we still have a very decent equity when we get called, because we still have the straight draw and the flush draw, so a ton of outs. And when you go all in on the turn and you have just pocket fives or whatever, you only have 2 outs, and this is never a good idea. And again, this is only our bluffing range. We also have a value range, so it's just to balance our value range. And again, when your opponent is aggressive, he's definitely overfolding the turn, because most of those players bluff way too often when overcard hits the turn, because they just see, oh, my opponent has usually a lot of jack x, 7x, and pairs. So when the turn is a king, he's overfolding, and that means that he also has just some random hands in his betting range, like ace 5 and hearts or whatever, and he feels we are just folding enough hands. So we make a lot of profit when he bluffs way too many hands on the turn. Okay, moving on, ace queen, whale limped. Of course, with ace queen we ISO and want to ISO a bit bigger against the whale, but the lag in the small blind has other plans. He goes ahead and 3-bets, and the funny thing is that the whale overcalls. I think folding is out of the question, so we go ahead and call with ace queen. Flop is pretty good. Flop is queen 7-5 rainbow, lag bets, whale calls, and I think in this situation we have pretty much no decision. When we raise, we fold out all their bluffs, and that's why calling should be the most profitable idea. Turn is an ace, lag bets, whale calls, and now it's just a question, should we call the turn or should we raise? And why do you think this is a better option? And as you can see, the flop and turn are really dry. So no flush draw possible, only a few gut shots like 10 jack, king jack type hands. And when the lag wants to bluff with those hands and he wants to continue bluffing those hands on the river, I'm definitely fine with that. And that's why I think calling is so much better than raising, because you can see it's really easy for us to get stacks in by the river, because they are 690 plus 605 in the pot, so 700 into 1300, something like this. So very easy to get stacks in. So if the lag and the whale just check the river, we can still jam ourselves and definitely get called often enough. And by raising, we just represent a very strong range, so ace X. But when we just call, I think it's possible that the whale is donating with the queen X type hand, cause he just do not like to fold a queen, and that's fine for me. And yeah, that's the reason why slow playing is so much better than raising the turn and folding all their bluffs. Okay, let's continue with 9-7 suited in the big blind. Situation this time is a bit different, so the whale limped. Loose passive, player ISOs. We have 9-7 suited in the big blind. With the whale on board, I think it's alright to defend. And yeah, we'll also call, so 3-handed to the flop. And flop is quite good for our hand, because we flop an open and straight draw. And the loose passive player bets. On this board texture, I think check calling the flop is okay. Turn is a 7, so we add equity to our hand. We check again, and now our opponent bets 70. So again, decision time. Do you want to call, do you want to fold, or do you want to raise? I think the problem on this turn card is really that he's not continuing with a lot of bluffs. The other problem is that the turn is a 7. And yes, now we have a pair, but the problem is when the river is a jack or a 6, there's now the 1 card straight, and we're probably not getting paid that often when those cards hit the river. And in some percentage of the time, we will be not ahead, because there are now a lot of better straights available. And yeah, that's why I think when he bets 70 on the turn, we have not enough equity to call, and we have not enough implieds when we hit our hands, so we're not getting paid often enough when we bink our straight on the river. And we play against a loose passive opponent, and therefore I think folding the turn should be the most profitable play. And we continue. This time we have 7-6 suited on the button, and that looks pretty nice. Good rake opens, lag calls, loose passive opponent calls, and of course our hand is good enough to call. And the whale of course also comes along, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-handed to the flop. And yeah, flop is pretty bad, but we are lucky because everyone checks. And we turn the gut shot to the nuts. Now the whale leads, good rake calls, lag calls, and the action is on us. And the question is, should we raise, should we call, or should we fold? I think when the whale bets and two opponents call, of course we do not have the best hand right now, but we have 4 outs to the nuts and probably a lot of implieds, because when we really bink the 5, can definitely also help one of our opponents, and therefore I think we should definitely make this call because we have so many implied odds and the price is not too bad and we have 4 opponents on the turn. So when you draw to the nuts, we can definitely justify calling the turn when we can win way more money on the river. With a hand like ace deuce, I think folding is usually better because we don't, we never draw to the nuts. So make sure that you really draw to the nuts and you can play for stacks when you make those close calls with your gut shots on the turn, and never draw to weak draws, like weak straight draws, weak flush draws. Always try to fold those hands. But when you think you play against weak players, you have a lot of implied odds, then of course when the price is good you can also call your gut shot type hands when you draw to the nuts. Okay, next hand we have ace-3 suited and a weak ABC rack opened in MP. Ace-3 suited, it's close, we are a bit deeper, he raised fairly small, so I think calling is in order. So heads up to the flop. He bet small, we have bottom pair, backdoor, straight backdoor flush draw, so no real decision, we just call the flop. Turn is a king, he bets 25. And yeah, what should we do? Should we call again? Should we raise? Should we fold? What's your play here and why? And to be honest, I think with force pair, we should not call. Probably we have not the best hand. It's way more likely that our opponent has a weak draw or a medium type mate hand. So a hand like 5x, 9x, 6s, 7s, 8s, maybe even 10s, jacks, queens, but I'm not sure. Something like this. And when those opponents bet smaller on the turn, their range is pretty weak in general. And yes, their range is weak, but they still beat our hand. So we only have one option. We can fold or we can raise, I think. And yeah, we can definitely have a lot of very strong hands like pocket 3s, pocket 5s, pocket 9s, king 9 suited. And therefore we raise the turn now with our bottom pair, turn this hand into a bluff. And yeah, with all the hands I mentioned, I'm sure most weak ABC racks are going to fold those hands in nearly 100% of the time. So really, really profitable bluff. The only important thing is that you can have some very strong hands in your range, and we definitely can have all the very strong hands in our flop calling range. And therefore, I think raising the turn is the best idea in this situation. And we're moving on. Pocket queens. Yeah, loose semi-rack limps. With queens, easy decision. We ISO. And as you can see, there's a whale in the small blind. He calls, semi-rack calls. Flop is quite good for our hand. So we are definitely going for the c-bet. Flop is very draw heavy, so we definitely want to bet on the larger side. Bet 75, whale calls, semi-rack folds. Turn is pretty good. And now the whale leads. He leads fairly small, he leads 65. Again, what should we do? Should we raise or should we call, and why? And again, we have to think about villain's range. I think it's not that likely that the whale has us beat, that he has a hand like jack 3 suited. Way more likely our opponent has a draw, like flush draw, straight draw, queen 10, king queen, 6 7, 7 8, clubs, a weak jack, a strong 9, something like this. And yeah, all those hands can definitely call a raise, and that's where we should go ahead and raise the turn. So definitely raise for value in a situation like this. The whale will call enough worse hands to your raise. And when you call, he pretty much gives himself the correct odds to draw with his straight draw or with his flush draw, and we should definitely avoid that. So please put in the raise on the turn that he's not getting the correct pot odds to draw. And of course with pocket queens, most of the time we should have the best hand, and our opponent is going to call with a ton of worse hands, so worse mate hands and just straight draws and flush draws. And that's why you should always raise the turn when your opponent bets so small and when he can have a large variety of hands. Okay, let's move on to the last hand example. We have pocket sevens, ABC rack opens, of course easy flat, and yeah, the lag 3 bets, so he squeezes. And with pocket sevens, easy decision, we call and we bink the set. He bets fairly small, pretty draw heavy board texture, so we definitely want to value raise with our set. That's what we do, we raise it up, and our opponent calls. Yeah, turn is not the best card in the world, because the straight gets there and the flush also gets there. But our opponent checks, there's 413 in the pot. Yeah, what should we do against the lag? Should we bet? Should we shove? Should we check behind? What's the best play in your eyes? And to be honest, I think we can still jam the turn, because I don't think our opponent has too many 8x hands in his 3-bet range pre-flop and in his flop bet call range. Sure, he can have some flushes, but he can have so many worse hands like queens, kings, aces, 10x, jack x. Really a ton of hands, and I think with some of his flushes he's just going to bet the turn himself. When you play against the lag, you really have to see that those players have a really large variety of hands, and even when he has hand like 10x, so yeah, jack 10, king 10, ace 10, 10 9, whatever, and he has one heart, he's really going nowhere. He's always going to call the turn, because in his eyes we also usually have not an 8 and not a flush, and therefore he is definitely going to call with his top pair or second pair and a good flush draw, and that's the reason why the turn bet is still very profitable. Of course, this really depends on your opponent, how aggressive he is and how often he likes to hero call. And yeah, I'm definitely not surprised if the lag calls here with king 10 offsuit. I've really seen it all, so definitely try to think about your opponent. What player type is he? What's his league? What's his range on the flop, on the turn, and how can you exploit this opponent? I hope that you enjoyed all the turn hand examples, and I hope that you get a pretty good idea how to play the turn on different runouts against different player types. So yeah, I'll see you next time, and this was Fallout 86 for RaiseYourEdge.com. Bye bye.